Overlord. Volume 14, Chapter 2, Countdown to Extinction, Part 3. He felt as though he had just heard an sound. Ins thought it sort of sounded like it was from himself. A Death Knight and a Death Warrior, two undead beings, had suddenly died. The one to defeat them was also wearing an item from Yggdrasil, the power suit. Ins had felt that he had lost two contacts, though the feeling wasn't too strong given how many connections he had at once, which was how he had come to learn that it wasn't an illusion. Silence filled the room. He felt the gaze of every floor guardian, perhaps the maids too, on him. Ins was the mastermind of this siege, so it would not have been wrong to view this as Ins's defeat. Though something unexpected had occurred, the puny force they had lost was sent there precisely because losing them would not have been a big deal. So Ins wished that they wouldn't act so tight and careful. However, given the current situation, if he was to tell them that it was fine to lose a battle, it would sound more like a sore loser's excuse. Hindsight is always perfect. His belief that he does not belong here would surely intensify. Ins decided to use his long-practiced acting skills, which of course, he had obtained by practicing in front of the mirror while the ordinary maids were absent. As I expected, The situation was under control. Ins displayed the same air of arrogance a mob boss quietly talking to themselves would have as they enjoyed the fragrance of the red wine from their wine glass. The important part of this act was to not speak in a loud voice. A loud voice would be quite lame right now. The trick was to act as if he was just mumbling to himself. His acting, the result of hard research, led to a ripple of commotion that reverberated around the room. Ins swallowed his non-existent saliva. Whether he had succeeded or not depended on Demiurge's response. I see. So. That. Was. Why? What? Cositus. While Ins was panicking, Ch2 responded, yes, as both of her hands shot up. Though it appeared that she was hailing him, she was simply calling attention to herself. Ch2 smiled with pride as everyone's gazes fell upon her. I understood it too, Aransu. Insama predicted that something like that would appear, Aransu. That was why we sent such a weak force, am I correct, Aransu? This felt different from usual. Was this a success or a failure? Ins stole a glance at Demiurge, but he was just smiling mysteriously while nodding his head. As expected of the both of you. The two of them held their heads high upon receiving Demiurge's praise. Perhaps Demiurge had already arrived at this conclusion but left it up to those two to answer first. Ins breathed a sigh of relief. This appeared to be a success. Albedo continued on. Intel from Sabas, Demiurge, and also our corroborators in the capital mentioned how Red Drop was operating in the northern end of the kingdom. Because of that, Insama decided to deploy insufficient troops to lure them out. The amount of troops struck the sweet spot of being easily defeatable by that guy, but at the same time enough to conquer the city without their help. Sajiga Insama. Like a hooked fish. That was Red Drop? Could we trust that intel? What are the possibilities that it was a player? If he was in a power suit from Yggdrasil, isn't the possibility that he was a player quite high? Could they be sure that that was Red Drop? If so, shouldn't that intel have reached him at some point or another? No, wait, it was absolutely more likely that Ins had simply missed that piece of intel while he read through the documents. For that reason, Ins pretended that all was according to plan with a burst of gentle laughter. Needless to say, he had practiced this laugh quite a few times too. He. I did not think that he would actually show up. I was quite shocked too. I thought that perhaps they were conserving their forces for the showdown at the capital. Insama can always think of situations we couldn't. Said Aura as Mare mumbled, amazing, to himself. The unadulterated gazes of reverence from those two dealt a massive blow to Ins now fragile as glass superego. It's not like that at all. But, he could never say those words. Ins had never considered such a thing could happen. Though he was of the mindset that losing was fine and winning was good, it was for different reasons than what they were now thinking of. Ins reminisced about the meeting between him, Sabas, and the others, the meeting that made Ins take charge of this battle. What is it, Sabas? Is something wrong? Ins had just returned to Nazarick and in front of him was Sabas, who was supposed to be on standby in Irantal, so it was natural for him to ask. Ins had no recollection of the contents of his last order to him, let alone of an order for him to come forth. Perhaps he was here of his own will, Ins was fine with that too. Though Sabas was stationed at Irantal, he was still given considerable amounts of freedom. The right to return to Nazarick at any time was a given. However, if his goal was to meet with Ins, he could have done so in Irantal. This must have been about something important and urgent. I'm terribly sorry, Ins-sama. Would you be so kind as to spare some of your precious time, or rather, could I bother you for a while? Ins felt as though there was something ominous hidden in Sabas' muddled choice of words. He ordered the ordinary maid closest to him, the one assigned to Ins for the day, to leave them be. The maid, along with the other maid who was assigned to this room, gently lowered their heads and left the room. Ins looked towards the 8 edge assassins on the ceiling. All of you, leave us be. The 8 edge assassins fell from the ceiling as if they were completely weightless and silently exited the room. If Ins had ordered them to never speak of what was said in this room, they would probably follow that order to their deaths, but magic existed in this world that could lead someone to dominate their minds and extract information through those means. Needless to say, even though Ins would never allow that to happen, it was still best to stay on their toes. Ins-sama, I am eternally grateful. If Sabas was the one to order them to leave, it would be akin to him saying that he did not trust his colleagues, the ordinary maids. So, his gratitude was probably directed at Ins' consideration to not start any tensions between them. Ins gently shook his head in response to what Sabas had said. To obtain the answer to the question he had in mind, Ins asked again. So, what's the matter? It doesn't seem like an ordinary matter. An emergency perhaps? Yes, ahem, no. I'm not too sure if this counts as out of the ordinary or not. Someone wishes to converse with Ins-sama in private. I was requested to ask for Ins-sama's presence at their behest. So they wish for me to go to them. They couldn't come to my room. Given that Ins was the supreme overlord of the great underground tomb of Nazarick, this was an uncommon request. This is not about that human, is it? No, it was not Ch2. It was a guardian who had not received permission to leave their area. They knew that this would be disrespectful, but they still wished to trouble Ins-sama for a while. Sabas looked towards Ins with an apologetic expression. Ah, I see. Ins understood. If it was an area guardian, then it all made sense. Of course, if he ordered them to come over, they would most likely do so. Some NPCs might respond in the negative due to a previous order from Ins' allies, who were their creators and whom they referred to as the 41 Supreme Beings. Still, most would obey Ins' order. There were also those who simply couldn't be allowed to leave. A good example of which would be one of the area guardians on the 7th floor, Kugane. Because of its passive aura, it would surely cause a lot of collateral damage just by moving to the 9th floor. Things like wool carpets catching fire would be fine, but if it were to cross paths with beings like the ordinary maids, they would surely take a lot of damage. If that was the case, it was better for Ins to go to it than the other way around. Ins had never liked putting on airs anyway. In addition, he did not have any tasks on hand that must be dealt with immediately. At least that was what Ins thought. Understood. I'll go to them. So, who am I looking for? It was Nigredo-sama and Pestonia. Sabas was one to refer to everybody else with the honorific sama, yet he did not do so with Pestonia. Was it because they were colleagues? It was those two. Ins' expression became dejected and he tried his best to hide that fact. Though Ins' skeletal face could not show any expressions, it appeared as though a select few of the guardians could actually cold read him. Albedo was one of them. As a side note, Demiurge would apparently always interpret his expression in weird ways. Was it on purpose? Ins had thought that he had hidden his emotions well enough, but it seemed like Sabas could still pick up on a few hints that slipped out of his vocal mannerisms. Sabas' expression had become more and more apologetic as a result. Though I feel sorry for Sabas, but honestly, I don't want to go. Nothing good will come of this. He could confidently state that. Imagine if you were in an office and someone told you, the people from that other department are looking for you. They don't want to call you but want you to go to them directly. 8 or 9 times out of 10 it would be about a hassle. That said, it wasn't as though Ins had a choice in this matter. If a larger issue rose up because he had neglected the smaller issues, the responsibility for the consequences would ultimately fall upon him. While it was true that Ins was the absolute overlord of Nazarick, for him to rest on his laurels would be moronic. Ins wanted none of the NPCs to dislike him, but rather, he desired that they would adore him just as he doted on them as if they were his children. Let's go. As for my schedule, Ins pulled out a notebook to check what he had scheduled for today. He was someone who would put off tasks that he found to be annoying, yet was also someone who would wish that said annoying affairs would be resolved as soon as possible. This time slot is fine, it's empty. Can we go there right now? Nigradu and Pestonia. Though both of them were area guardians, with what Sabas had just stated, Ins knew exactly where they were going. That was why he could still convey his intentions to Sabas even with these half-questions. If we were to allow Pestonia to arrive there first, how about an hour later? That's fine. Looks like it would be inappropriate to bring Albedo and Demiurge along. Yes. Though it pains me to say this, they hoped that Insama would be going there alone. Ins nodded his head. What about that doll? I will ask Pestonia to take care of that matter, there should not be any problems. Good. An hour later then, Sabas, will you be going too? Yes. I had hoped that you would grant me permission to. Am I allowed to? Sabas lowered his head of white upon receiving Ins's approval. An hour later, Ins used the power of the ring to teleport to the frozen prison on the 5th floor. No one was accompanying him. He had told the ordinary maid assigned to him that he had important matters to attend to and had ordered her to keep the secret and stay behind. At first she had protested by saying, I will pretend that I saw nothing at all. You could just ignore my presence entirely, so please take me along with you. While Ins did find her suggestion to be trustworthy, she did appear to derive some form of fulfillment from being ignored. He had talked this over with her in the past and her response was that for him to objectify them, would have meant that they had accomplished their duty as maids to the utmost. They were apparently also actively seeking that kind of interaction. Then again, he had only asked one of them, so perhaps she was the only one. No, she had to be the only one with such a fetish. Even if it was an ordinary maid like her, to guarantee that he did not leave even the 1% of a probability that this could snowball into something bigger, Ins steeled himself. I should do something that'll make her happier when I get back, maybe assign her to some bothersome and menial task, so that she'll be happy or whatever. Yeah, I don't get it at all. There were just too many people in Nazarick who behaved like this maid, that was why none of his long-term vacation and paid leave policies ever took off. If this persisted, Ins's hopes and dreams were all doomed to fail. Ins pushed open the fairy tale-esque, chateau-style layered frozen doors. Just as before, a chilly breeze flowed out from within, but Ins, as an undead with complete immunity to freezing temperatures, was not bothered by it anyway. Ins walked alone through the gloomy corridors. Other than checking for holes in the ceiling as he walked, he strode non-stop to a door that stood as the centerpiece of a giant mural which spanned the entirety of the wall. Just as before, the plaster on select spots of the mural had already fallen off. It looked quite miserable. The door took a single push and silently slid open, the 3 occupants of the room stood up to greet Ins. The owner of the room, Ch2. The dog-headed maid, Pestonia. And the last of the trio, Sabas. Welcome, Ins-sama. With the room's owner, Ch2's invitation, Ins approached the table at which they sat. The last time he had been in this room, all it had was a cradle. This time the cradle was nowhere to be seen, just a table and 4 chairs. Those were probably appropriated from other rooms within the frozen prison. As a side note, Ch2 was only the area guardian of the above-ground portion of the frozen prison, Neuronist was the area guardian of the underground portion. After Ins had taken his seat, Pestonia immediately began to prepare some tea. The steam emanating from the teacup in front him carried with it the aroma of the black tea held within. Sabas brought out some biscuits at the same time. Of course, Ins could not consume anything with his body, but he gladly accepted their hospitality anyways. After that, Ins ordered the still-standing 3 of them to sit down. The biscuits that were delivered to Ins were not sophisticated at all, they were just plain squares. That could be said to be a rare sight in Nazarick. Was this someone's experiment? Ins looked towards Sabas and asked about them through his gaze alone, prompting Sabas to reply. Those are not from Nazarick, but goods I had brought back from Irantal. Due to the current abundance of cheap and fresh ingredients being brought into the city, a food culture is slowly developing there. This biscuit is among the foods being developed. It was said to be harder previously, but is now quite soft. I've tried some already, it's at an acceptable level of quality for a snack, woof. Ins took a biscuit and bit down on it. Indeed, it wasn't as tough as he had expected. The biscuit snapped in half as Ins caught the crumbs from the inside of his jaw cavity and placed the pieces next to the cup of black tea. He could tell the texture of the biscuit, but not its taste. What a disappointment of a body. However, from Ins's perspective it wasn't so at all. It was specifically because of the fact that this body had no libido, appetite, and somnolence that he could succeed in his role as the ruler of Nazarick. If one of those aspects were to apply to him, surely he would have been in an endless fall from grace since the beginning. If Ins-sama was to rent out more of his undead for agricultural purposes, then there would certainly be developments in the improvements of breeds of food. The food culture would surely blossom and perhaps they could even produce food of an equal quality compared to Nazarick's offering. That would be great. Because of my body, I couldn't investigate the buffs incurred by different food items before. If we were to invest more resources into this, it could help strengthen Nazarick. But if that was the case, I assume those without cook levels can't cook at all then. We were concerned about that too, so it would be best to save as many purebreds as we possibly could. Ins nodded in approval in response to Ch2's suggestion. Suddenly, Ins was reminded of the European biodomes of the past and the conflicts that arose surrounding the seed banks. Though he wasn't too interested in the topic back then, Blue Planet was riled up all over it. Ah, yes. It would be best. A task force should be formed to handle this matter. He should probably propose this idea to Albedo. Now then, it's about time that we address the main topic at hand. Tell me. Why was I summoned here? Ch2, as their representative, spoke. Yes. Given the current situation, isn't it about time that we stop massacring the citizens of the kingdom? Negative. Anyways, shouldn't this be something that you should ask of your direct superiors, the floor guardians, rather than me? Ins replied immediately. The denizens of Nazarick, especially the area guardians, had been informed, in writing, the actions of floor guardians and the goals behind them. If they had any suggestions, they should be reporting to their superiors, the floor guardians. This was to unify the various denizens of Nazarick, to gain the opinions of those with different points of view and to pique the interest and curiosity of them all. However, though Ch2 was stating her opinions just as he had hoped they would, she should have done so to her direct superior, the floor guardian of the 5th floor, Cositus. If Ins was to accept her suggestion directly, it would be detrimental to Ch2's authority. As a social conformist, he absolutely could not do that. If some of you don't understand, do try skipping your own superior and petitioning a higher up from another department if you will. Do you understand now? Nothing good would come of that. From that perspective, as the head of the board of directors, the company hierarchy analog to guildmaster should be able to do so, but to rouse discord among his subordinates could ultimately lead the company into a difficult situation and thus should be avoided at all costs. If it was in the stead of the floor guardian of the fourth floor, Gargantua, instead, would be willing to do so. Insama is correct. So, do permit me to raise this suggestion too, Wolf. In a sense, Pestonia's direct superior would be Sabas. If a floor guardian was to be assigned to the 9th and 10th floors, Sabas would be the floor guardian of the 9th and Albedo would be the one for the 10th. Because Sabas had been the one to have invited there shouldn't be an issue with indignity at all. I see, I understand your feelings now, but I do want to ask one question. This war is a massive experiment for the greater good of strengthening the great underground tomb of Nazarick, our home. It wouldn't halt just by the grace of mercy alone. So, was your suggestion built upon this premise? Make no mistake, the great underground tomb of Nazarick, the source Rouse kingdom of Olgaun, is not unique, nor is it invincible. If they were to encounter another guild that was also transported to this world, they could lose. To assume that they were the only ones to have transported here, would be far too optimistic. To be honest, he had already felt the presence of other world-class items, so it wasn't a far stretch of the imagination to assume that some other guild existed elsewhere. This was why, to guarantee victory for an inevitable guild war, it was his duty as the guild master to strengthen Nazarick as much as he could. By what grace may they be spared if it is not by mercy alone? Woof. What do you mean? If there are any benefits to be reaped from your suggestion, do tell. That said, if it's something along the lines of if we spare as many people as possible, a strong being may be born in the future, I will not entertain it. Throughout the kingdom's history, it has produced nothing stronger than adamantite-ranked adventurers. In terms of pure power alone, perhaps this was humanity's limit. If that was the case, it's better to give preference to dragons or other stronger races. All infants have potential, Insama. Pestonia gave Nigradu a cold eye. At least he thought it was glare. Not just the infants, Wolf. Nigradu had a soft spot for babies, perhaps even surpassing that of Pestonia's. However, her compassion is limited to only that of infants. Once they live past the age of 2, she sees them as nothing but sacks of meat to be disposed of. For that reason, the toddlers that had been saved during the assault on the capital had left Nigradu's care and were placed under Pestonia once they were 2 years old. They were probably transferred to Yuri's orphanage by now. I see, that is true. But, isn't the same true for dragonlings too? What we had just talked about, improving the breeds of food, doesn't that apply to humans too? If we were to apply the different techniques we have in Nazarick to strengthen them, surely stronger varieties of humans could be made. Plus, a race's value isn't just in their strength, humanity's propensity for creativity in their creations, you could call it the ability of cultural development. I believe they do have that ability. If we were to reduce their population to nothing, isn't that a great opportunity cost to Nazarick? Was that why they had given the biscuits? If that was the case, everything had been playing out the way they had intended for it to. No, that did not matter much. As long as they could convince it would be their victory. Indeed, that is worth considering. However, I do not wish for the inhabitants of this world to become too strong, even to the extent that I believe their development of civilization to be a threat. Curled his hand into a fist. Those who are strong but could not get stronger and those who are weak but still have room for growth, a turn of tides must be avoided at all costs. Once we discover the slightest possibility of that happening, we must prevent it at all costs. This is all for Nazarick's good, isn't it? The two of them fell silent. Ins shifted his gaze onto Sabas. Sabas hadn't spoken since then. I'm grateful that Insama was willing to come down here and lend an ear to their thoughts. That is why I will not be making any further requests. Ins cupped his chin and turned his gaze back onto the two of them. It is true that it would be disadvantageous for us to push humanity to the brink of extinction. When push comes to shove, they would do anything to become stronger out of desperation. For that reason, it is best for us to wipe out all who have had that kind of experience. If you want to nurture them, nurture the ones who have not gone through those kinds of experiences, those without the drive to strengthen themselves. Ins alternated his gaze between the two of them. Are we done here? Shall I return to my room? Not yet, Wolf. Pestonia's voice was a bit too loud. She lowered her head in shame and said, I'm very sorry. It's fine. Rather than apologizing, do speak your mind. Yes, Insama. I heard that your strategy this time around was called Candy and Whip, to let the countries around us know the difference in outcome between the empire who chose to become our vassal and the kingdom who chose to oppose us as enemies. Was that the reason for the current massacre, Wolf? Pestonia continued after Ins had nodded. As more and more people manage to escape through great tribulations, wouldn't the perception of how foolish it is to disobey Insama, or rather the Source Rouse Kingdom, become more widespread? Wolf. You're suggesting that I should intentionally let more of them go because of that? Yes, Wolf. If that was the case, there was some value in allowing them to escape. But he did not believe that Albedo and Demiurge had not given consideration to this already. Both of them were the type to not execute a plan until they had thought of even these kinds of possibilities. If Ins were to allow that, he would be executing a plan that Albedo and Demiurge had abandoned for some reason. How would those two, who always mistook Ins's actions to be that of a genius, react to this? Ins's non-existent stomach cramped up the moment he thought about this. Wait, no, he had told them that, I will be making mistakes intentionally, so even if something out of the ordinary happened, it could still work out fine at the end. However, the real issue lay in what would happen afterwards, specifically the actions of those who would call the color white as black and vice versa if he did it first. If they gave up on the plan due to a fatal flaw and I ordered them to carry it out anyways, it could lead to massive losses on our side. It would be the same as a company that experienced massive losses due to the CEO's incompetence while the employees were helpless to stop it from happening. Even if they were to recover the loss, someone like me would be too meek and powerless to do anything about it. Someone who couldn't even shoulder the responsibilities and consequences of their actions shouldn't be doing something like this. But even if he wanted to reject it, he couldn't put his finger on exactly what was wrong with Pestonia's suggestion. Even though a simple no would have probably sufficed. So I should have forcefully brought Albedo and Demiurge along, But he had not done so because he had more or less figured out what this meeting would be about after learning that it was with Nigredu and Pestonia. This was why it had turned into a difficult situation. Because, those two had been imprisoned before. Back then, Albedo had already suggested executing them. He was afraid that if the same thing was to occur again that Albedo would strongly request execution. He was also afraid of a future irreconcilable division. An organization that seemed formidable to outsiders could still crumble down from the inside. That was why they had to avoid anything that could pose a threat to them. So then, what should he do now? His common sense told him to reject their suggestion, but something still troubled him, the future. Though the great underground tomb of Nazarick would only accept one set of outsiders into their ranks, the Source Rouse Kingdom of Insolgaun had already absorbed a large number of outsiders. Though they may not hold any important posts within the organization, that was probably only a temporary measure. If those outsiders were to become high-ranked officials, they would certainly hold quite a lot of different opinions. Perhaps there would also be suggestions for benevolence that would make Albedo and the rest call them weak-willed or something similar. Would it be possible to task Ch2 and Pestonia with integrating those kinds of opinions? If that was the case, ignoring their suggestions now could lead to problems later on. If people with similar opinions as them were the exception in Nazarick, then he should divert even more attention towards this issue. Also, I have already repaid the kindness Touch-me-san had shown to me, so if I was to consider this as repaying Machi-chan and Tabula-san's kindness, this should be fine. Though I believe that all of you should know this by now, I'll repeat it again. I never intended to wipe out every single human from the kingdom. The truth is, we have already convinced multiple nobles to join our side. At most, only around 90% of them will be killed. So some people chosen to be spared will live under the Nazarick's rule. Woof. I don't believe that would advertise the message louder than if we were to let the unchosen ones escape. He could understand Pestonia's will to help those who had not been chosen by them. I completely understand what you're trying to say. If it is not out of mercy, but rather for the greater good of Nazarick, there is room for consideration. I'll consider letting a few of them go. We're eternally grateful. We're eternally grateful, woof. Saba silently lowered his head as well. Still, though he had said that, he did not know exactly how he should go about this. In's heart grew heavy. He had to think up a solution. Perhaps he only needed to let a few hundred people go to appease them. Though this was completely unexpected, it was true that the vast majority of the city's population had survived. As long as he allowed them to escape, he would have fulfilled his promise to those two. That said, it wouldn't count as the survivors escaping through great tribulations. Should he send stronger undead to try again? No, there was something he had to confirm before then. Ahem. Now then, Albedo. Though you have said that this was Red Drop, how trustworthy is our intel source on this one? I am terribly sorry, Insama. Indeed, we do not have concrete proof of that claim. This was only a surface-level deduction based on the adamantite plate on the armor as well as its color. Albedo stood up and bowed deeply. At ease. I just wanted to check if you had access to intel that I did not. I am not too bothered by it. While he was happy that she was this loyal, being treated like that usually made him quite uncomfortable. To Ins, the manifestation of the concept of failure, this wasn't that big of a deal. However, it wasn't as though what she had just described could be categorized as a failure anyways. You have my eternal gratitude, Insama. So was that Red Drop, or a plot by someone who wants us to believe that they are Red Drop? Floor Guardians, speak your mind. From their brief opinions, most of them supported the former. Ins thought it was the former too. Now, then I must ask something of everyone once again. Does anyone know of the specs of a powered suit? If you are all not too sure of it, I will explain. Ins confirmed that the Guardians knew not of the powered suit and began to exposit what he remembered of the powered suit's abilities. Back in the game of Yggdrasil, the powered suit did not exist initially but was added in later on as an item for newly registered players to power level with. Also, mecha fighting games were popular back then, so it must have also been an attempt to draw in players from that player base as well. Though he couldn't tell whether that contributed to this fact or not, the powered suit's capabilities were quite high. First of all, just as they had seen, the suit had the ability to fly through the air at a greater speed than fly. It could maintain operations for over an hour underwater without any detriments and was essentially immune to almost all environmental damage. It could even apply and activate with its shoulders, torso, and depending on the type, even the wrists and feet different kinds of offensive spells. Though this might seem obvious, it does have human finger-like appendages that could, if the hand had not been transformed into a weapon itself, hold weapons. The magical armaments could be freely customized within the powered suit settings, but half were microtransaction exclusives while the other half required grinding. Though those customizations could be performed pretty much anywhere outside of combat, there were still some restrictions on them. The highest tier of spells that could be stored on the armor was 10th tier, and the use of said spell was subjected to a limit of an hour per use. Stronger spells had even more limited uses. Though the number of times a spell could be used recovered over time, it appeared to have a restriction by which the spell stored on it could not be swapped out for a duration even if it was only expended by a little. The armor's physical and magic damage were high tier, independent of the user's abilities. The same was true for its defensive and evasive capabilities. You could call it an armor that instantly closed the gap between the weak and the strong. Speaking of weakness, it did have two minor ones. One of which was the fact that because it counted as full body armor, it could not be combined with other pieces of armor. Still, necklaces and other decorative equipment could still be worn with it. Another was the fact that the magic stored in the armor could not have metamagic applied to it. But, since those spells could still be enhanced through equipment, this couldn't really be considered a weakness at all. However, if a weakling was to use it, it did have a major weakness: HP and MP. Though the damage output of the suit could compensate for the wearer's low stats, the HP and MP values of the wearer remained unaltered by the armor. That is to say, a weakling in the armor would have high defensive capabilities but also a frail health pool. Of course, if their opponent could not break through the armor's relatively high defenses, it's not a weakness at all. In Nazarik's terms, a floor guardian shouldn't have an issue fighting it at all. The threat it posed was to NPCs like the Pleiades, who weren't that strong. If they crossed paths with the suit, they should choose to retreat. Ins concluded his explanation and started taking questions. The first to ask a question was Albedo. So as long as we are the ones handling it, it should be fine, correct? Correct. Even the strongest powered suits could only have the offensive capabilities equivalent to level 80 characters. However, that hinges on my knowledge on the powered suits being perfect. Hypothetically, if there were rarer or artifact grade powered suits, it would be a completely different situation. If that was the case, there could be powered suits much more powerful than the ones I have described. Can you not tell from its appearance alone? I apologize, Aura. Because I am not too familiar with powered suits in the first place, I cannot tell its capabilities just from appearances alone. Also, though one would not be allowed to alter its appearances by too much, there were still slight alterations the wearer could make to it. While the powered suit might be useful to weaker players, it was completely useless to a stronger player. Never mind divine grade gear, even legendary grade equipment matching a player's strengths could outperform the powered suit. That was why when powered suit was introduced to Yggdrasil, Ins and his friends, who were already at max level, were not interested. The greater issue to Ins back then was that he could barely cast spells with it equipped. Were there 2 or 3? There should be a few sets of powered suits in Nazarik. I will head to the treasury later for them. Maybe everyone should get a feel of what it is like to wear one. He remembered that the thing should still be there, something that Amanama Hitosu had procured after learning that even those with manufacturing-based job levels could enter combat with them. Apparently he was secretly quite confident because he also played aerial combat games, but then he got easily wrecked by Pararon Sino in a mock battle. The thing was never seen again after that. He also remembered how Nishiki Enrei had said, just play average instead LMAO. Ins was journeying through his memories when he realized. If Red Drop had a powered suit from Yggdrasil, the black sword of the leader of the other Adamantite rank team, Blue Roses, could be of a similar power level. According to the intel they had gathered from their aides in the capital, the weapon she wielded was said to be powerful enough to level an entire city. Though that aide found the intel to be preposterous, it did originate from a member of the team itself. Ins always thought that she was either lying to her teammates, or just making things up. But given what he knew now, perhaps that intel was true. He had heard that the leaders of Blue Roses and Red Drop were relatives. If they were related, then having the same level of equipment shouldn't be weird at all. Of course, Ins wasn't paranoid enough to believe that the floor guardians could be one-shotted by anything, but he also had no proof that that was a complete impossibility. Perhaps the guardians' defenses could be easily breached by some strong weapon from this world. Ins did not want to suffer any severe consequences for forcing his opponent to the stage where she would be suicidal enough to use that sword's power. If it came down to a battle with blue roses, he should probably use summoned monsters to bait out that ability and then defeat them. However, that would be the last resort. He remembers a saying about how the better part of valor is discretion. He should follow that advice. After all, the primary purpose of the kingdom's destruction wasn't for the termination of blue roses, but if they were to get in his way he wouldn't mind killing them off. That said, it was best not to make any rash movements before they knew the full capabilities of that woman's sword. I should say sorry to Entama and hope she understands. Ins mentally sighed to himself as he shook his head in an attempt to get his train of thought back on track. This wasn't the time to be thinking about these sorts of things. Any other questions? Ins looked around. It appeared that none of the guardians had any other questions. If that is the case, we will pause the discussion on the powered suit for now. Now then, Demiurge, how shall we deal with the city? In my opinion, to have baited that thing out was more than satisfactory. It would be bad for them to mistake that they had defeated the Sorcerer's kingdom. We should send a stronger entity and unto dust they shall return. That is fine too. No, that wasn't fine at all. If they did that, he would have to try extra hard to save some other city to keep the promise he had made to those two. Though he made it through this time, to accomplish it again would be extremely difficult. For Pestonia's sake, who had been standing behind him and listening in, he had to save the people of the city to fulfill their promise. No, Demiurge. Let us not do that for now. This will prepare us for similar situations should they occur again. In any case, it is about time that we siege the capital. Let us close the curtains on this battle. We will be fine as long as we systematically scorched earth the rest of the cities. What do you think? He was giving the city's inhabitants the chance and time to run away. If they get killed afterwards because they didn't escape, those two shouldn't have a problem with it, right? If Insama deems it so, so be it. Though it might seem as though Demiurge was being sarcastic, he wasn't one to do such a thing to Ins. Some people could always hear all sorts of undertones in other people's words, those who usually have something to hide themselves, Ins being one of them. Don't say that, Demiurge. If you have a better idea then that should be the one that we should implement. As expected of Insama. I am truly in awe of how humble you are. Ins's opinions of the bowing Demiurge became muddled. First of all, what he had said was common sense, it was nothing worth praising. Though he was flattered, he felt as though he was being treated more like a child if even the most trivial of the things he had said and done was cheered. Perhaps that was just out of his low self-esteem. Do any of the other guardians have different opinions? Ins turned to Shaltir upon confirming that there were no objections. Bring back the undead we had sent using gate. Then, gather our forces in Irantal and initiate the siege on the capital. Yes, my lord. I will get on with that immediately, Aransu. Will the main army include people from Nazarick? Send out the master guarders of Nazarick and the other elite guards. They are not too strong individually but are quite a sight to behold as a unit. Roger. Excellent. We will conquer the cities one by one and stage the final battle at the capital as planned. Afterwards, though it might be out of order now, we will finish massacring the inhabitants of all the useless cities. Through this show of force, the world will come to understand the consequences of not bowing to the rule of Nazarick. The floor guardians all responded with confidence. Ins nodded deeply. Very well then, floor guardians. Ins thought about the future for a while and opened his mouth again to say, no, a portion of the guardians should stay behind. Everybody else, demonstrate to me your true power.